The story of Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec begins while Polyphony Digital was still developing Gran Turismo 2. They split the team in half working on both games, then after GT2 was released near the end of the millennium, also considered one of the greatest games ever made for the PS1, they already worked on GT3 for over a year at that point. To show how much faith Sony had in Gran Turismo as a franchise, when the PlayStation 2 was unveiled for the first time at the Tokyo Game Show on September 1999, next to it was a copy of Gran Turismo 2000. Not bad, right? New hardware meant new discoveries during development, and if you know Kazunori Yamauchi's backstory and ambition, you bet his team were gonna make something that gave us a reason to buy a PlayStation 2. In fact, he got ahead of himself like he usually does. In Gran Turismo 2, for example, he promised drag races mechanical damage in 12 cars on the track at once, and for Gran Turismo 3, he promised more cars than the predecessor, that you can clearly see the driver from outside the car and be able to choose your own helmet, and different weather effects and time of day for every single track. And though he didn't promise this in GT3, Yamauchi also talked about his ambition to take the series online, where it was more than just random lobbies for players to race against each other, calling it the Gran Turismo Network, or GTN, and intended to release it as early as 2002. Though it would take 9 years for them to introduce online gameplay. Point is, he was talking about an esports structure that would become top priority in the most recent Gran Turismo titles way back in 2001, before the internet is what it is today, especially on consoles, and he considered Gran Turismo 3 to be the final chapter of single player focus, with the ability to link up to 6 PlayStation 2s together so multiple players can race against each other as a precursor. I think it's obvious to anyone who watches reviews on this channel knows that I'm not a fan of online centered games, but I do admit this is another case of Yamauchi being well ahead of his time. First impressions of the demo were as positive as you'd expect, like just imagine seeing this in 1999 before Gran Turismo 2 was officially released. Although some of the effects even back then appeared exaggerated, like the heat on the track, the shine on the cars, as well as some models appearing squished, out of proportion somehow. And though it was constantly talked about during the PS2 launch, some were also not a fan of the pressure-sensitive buttons utilized for braking and accelerating, but it nonetheless generated a lot of hype, and Polyphony must have taken whatever criticism they received to heart, because despite not meeting the North America PlayStation 2 launch date, delaying it all the way to next year, renaming it Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec, it appeared justified when comparing the demo to the final product, which made the former look like another PS1 sequel in comparison. It was released on April 2001 in Japan and the rest of the world by July. Like the cover of GT 2000 being shown off at the Tokyo Expo in '99, Gran Turismo 3 was the video game that introduced me to the PlayStation 2. It was a birthday party in early 2002, a couple of kids were versing each other on the Super Speedway in the arcade mode. I didn't get a turn, but it was still very cool to see this console with way better graphics than that inferior slim PS1 back home. Still can't believe I had to wait another 4 years to finally get my own PS2. And like the first couple of Gran Turismo reviews, it was one of the first main reviews on my channel in lovely stretched composite output. But for this review I'll be using the PC SX2 emulator, which aside from a few graphical hiccups should hopefully look a lot more professional in comparison. Now, Gran Turismo 3 is obviously excellent, but for a long time I placed this in my personal top 5 all-time favourites. However, because I only really have time for games that I review because they take so long to make, it means the last time I gave this one a proper go was when I reviewed it in 2016. It's one of the main reasons I'm re-reviewing the Gran Turismo series, because it's a good excuse to go back to these games again and get something productive out of it. With the hundreds of games I've reviewed since that original one back in 2016, a majority of them being racing ones, and with a broader perception of what makes games like these fun, going back to Gran Turismo 3, is it still that top 5 all-time favourite? On the surface, Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec is nothing more than an upgraded expansion of Gran Turismo 2. Apart from red dominating the main menu in the game's cover, the menus have a similar colour palette and identical sound effects. It's this style of presentation that connects this game more so to the predecessors than Gran Turismo 4, which almost looks like a different racing franchise. Going into the Gran Turismo mode, navigation is even simpler. One car dealership, mechanic, and building to enter events. I can only imagine how clogged this part of driving heaven would be during rush hour. So entering the dealership to purchase your first car, you'll notice how limited the range of the cars available, and not because of the number of credits you have when you start. Unlike GT2, which had over 600 cars, this one has a grand total of 185. And that might have disappointed a few people. In fact, in today's world, if this was the case, no matter how good the rest of the game is, it would inevitably get review bombed by fans. Just look at Forza Motorsport 5 and Gran Turismo Sport when they launched. But when you think about that number in GT2, half the lineup was second-hand Japanese cars nobody wanted with multiple badges of the same thing. Toyota Prius or Nissan Cube, anybody? How many of these cars did you actually take for a drive outside the license tests? And you have to keep in mind that with GT2, Polyphony essentially had a ready-made game to work with when developing it. They just added more to it, and there was a stretch when they were working on both these games at the same time. It's incredible they pulled everything off in such a short amount of time between two console generations. Gran Turismo 3 doesn't even have a used car dealership. They wanted each model, even your first one, to look like something to drool over. Whether it's in a showroom or whenever you win a prize car, disappointed that it isn't quick enough for the next event, but I'll get to that. Point is, when I scroll through the showroom in the arcade mode back in the early 2000s, I was genuinely in awe by the attention to detail put into these cars. And that's why I've cut to native PS2 footage right here, because this is how we saw these cars in 2001. I admit the footage never looks good in PAL format, but seeing them on my TV in component, they still look very good. According to Kaz, it took a day to design a car in Gran Turismo 2, whereas in this one, designing a car would take a month. Although Kiichi Ashizawa claimed it took nearly as long while developing Gran Turismo 2, but the least I'll concede is that each car in GT3 has over 10 times the number of polygons compared to the PS1 titles. That might not look like much by today's standards, with the cars in Gran Turismo 7 having 500,000 polygons each. Still, this is a 2001 game we're looking at. I noticed during the making of GT3 there were prototype models of a Lamborghini Diablo and Bugatti EV110. In fact, the Diablo does make an appearance in the Japanese version of the game, but licensed and badged under the Japanese Lamborghini Owners Club, the JLOC, but removed it outside of Japan for legal reasons, and Lamborghini along with other known European exotic brands wouldn't appear until Gran Turismo on the PSP, with the exception of Pagani. This is also the first Gran Turismo title to introduce Formula 1 cars, sort of. They're unlicensed versions of classic models including the Williams FW11, Lotus 99T, and McLaren MP44, and the PAL region, always considered second rate by gaming publishers, are just plain mashups of all of them. You'd think because Sony owned the license to publish F1 games at the time that they also be allowed to put a few official ones into a Gran Turismo title as well. At least they're just as quick as their real life counterparts and seriously invaluable to the GT mode. Another thing I like is the inclusion of race cars right off the bat in the arcade mode. Yes, I know you only have a few tracks to race on, but you can unlock the rest of them by simply winning on them in single race. So as a first impression, that was a crucial part in getting me into this series when I was a little kid. The same can't be said for the Gran Turismo mode, however. I would have thought the license test would be the most tedious part, but there are less of them to do here. There isn't too much to say apart from Rally getting its own license and complex string being used a lot. Like what would happen if you took all the licensed roads from GT2 and combined them to make one circuit? You can tell the developers had fun making this track. But anyway, you know how the predecessors, you get your first car, win the Sunday Cup first, and then realize it isn't quick enough for anything else after that, so you have to redo the Sunday Cup every day? Yeah, I know that didn't make sense. The point is, if you didn't like doing that in those games, then you're going to hate this game. For starters, it's easy to accidentally purchase a car that's too slow to compete even in the Sunday Cup. At least that's nearly the experience just in this playthrough alone. I got a Toyota Yaris, bought some upgrades to make sure I can win and also prepare myself for the Yaris Cup when I had enough money. And and as you can see I was barely able to win, so there was no chance this car would fare any better in any other event in the rest of the GT mode. Therefore, redoing the same event on the same circuit is the only option. You're essentially competing in an endurance event with multiple pit stops. Another handicap compared to GT2 is with the single race events you can't win the same prize car over and over again, so it's a guarantee you'll go through stretches where you're either saving up for another car or upgrade, and doing this more often than GT2, taking so much longer. Like I had to drive in a Sunday Cup race 18 times before acquiring something worthwhile. You can always count on Mustang Sally to be the true first car in the GT mode. It all comes down to your approach. Some might earn prize cars by placing gold in every license test, or go for as many of the beginner events before climbing the career ladder that way. I find that approach not very reliable, since the prize cars you earn in that stretch aren't worth the effort anyway, so it's likely you'll find yourself repeating events anyway. Kind of ironic the upgrades you fit on a car to win these races cost more than the prize money earned in said races. At the end of the day, out of human nature, we always look for what earns the most money in the shortest amount of time. So my advice is to get a car that would be classified in the Class A area in the arcade mode and throw as many upgrades as possible. Eventually there'll be a moment when your favorite car is tuned to the point of being well over the limiter, and it's also quick enough for the professional fans. And that's when the floodgates open. Winning prize cars worthy of advancing through GT mode and ticking off events one by one. Everybody has a moment in the Gran Turismo mode when they know the tide has turned, things kick into gear, and even with all that grinding, it still feels worthwhile. It just takes more time with additional events and not being able to win the same prize car. Just don't get discouraged. Like the predecessors, there's plenty of variety in the GT mode: endurance, rally, drivetrain, body type, as well as manufacturer and car model. I know these were technically in GT2, but they felt like afterthoughts where they can only be found in the dealership and they set themselves on a random circuit. Here they feel more like they're part of the main game. I also like the illustrations on display, which makes the menu simple but vibrant at the same time. Or maybe it's just another part of that nostalgia I had for GT3 in the early 2000s, scrolling through the events with that music you're hearing right now, finding which cars are eligible and work out which car is suitable. Then upgrade it to the max, because of course you would. Although having multiple versions of the same event feels like a ploy to add unnecessary gameplay time given the lower counts on everything else. But I suppose the opponents you face are different, faster as you advance through the leagues. The tracks used are different each time, and anything 5 laps or over has tyre wear, which is essentially your difficulty curve. What I actually find a bit funny is how clueless opponents are when it comes to tyre choices and pit strategies. There was a championship where I was up against an opponent faster than me, but because the races were only 5 laps, my tyres would last the whole race without pitting in. But that opponent in front always did, and throughout the series they never changed their strategy. And sometimes it'd be the other way around, they refused to pit in and slide all over the place. I'm almost convinced that it's just an emulation glitch from the PS2 emulator. But hey, it benefits the result for me, so I'm not complaining. Just something to point out considering how good the AI is despite it. With championships, you get a choice of 3, 4, or 5 prize cards. No wait, let me rephrase, the game chooses for you. Okay. But what if there happens to be an F1 car lurking in there and you don't get it? Really, the strategy is to win a championship with a race to spare so you can save in the middle of it, which is something you can do unlike the predecessors, since some championships have more than 5 races, but I digress. So if the prize car you win isn't what you desire, just reload the save profile and repeat until you get the car you want. Or they could have just let you choose what you want instead. It's ridiculous, this setup. It's a minor thing to note, but I like that the circuits are in reverse again. In Gran Turismo 2, it seemed like throughout the first stretch, when it was tedious enough trying to earn credits, Rome Circuit, Grindelwald and Midfield Raceway were being overused in a lot of the events. And since it never utilized the reverse layout, it made the game more repetitive than it should have been. In Gran Turismo 3, there are 19 circuits including dirt tracks, but not including reverse variations, nor short. No wait, hang on, there are no shortened variations. Anyway, 4 of them make their introduction in this game, including Swiss Alps, Tokyo R246, Circuit de Monaco, and aforementioned Complex Street. The latter its sole appearance in the series and a missed opportunity to turn it into an endurance event. I really wish they didn't omit as many as they did. No Red Rock Valley, Grindelwald, Rome Night, not even classics like High Speed Ring or Autumn Ring appear in this game. And the fact there are no shortened variations, your Grand Valley East section or Clubman Stage Route 5 or Seattle Short, it just makes some of the events with slower cars feel longer than they should. Nonetheless, these are classic and nostalgic to drive on again in this game specifically, that's for sure. The tracks still resemble the PS1 versions before looking more realistic, another indicator of how GT3 follows those titles more closely than its eventual successors. Not a bad thing or anything, just something that stood out to me, even back when I played these games growing up. As I said in the beginning of the review, one thing Polyphony wanted to do with the circuits is have the ability to choose the weather or time of day, and in the Gran Turismo mode it would have likely been randomized to add a bit of unpredictability in the races. That's why some of the tracks are set during dusk: Laguna Seca, Smoky Mountain, Seattle Circuit, and reverse variations of Grand Valley, Deep Forest and Swiss Alps, more than you might think. And there's also a wet version of Special Stage Route 5, another demonstration of what weather effects would have looked like if they went all out. Apparently only 2 cars can be on the track at once to make it work, which is why it's turned into a rally event, not just because of the slippery surface. The developers were clearly fans of night racing, and it shows on screen, seeing the reflections of the circuit on the road and the bright colourful lights of Special Stage Route 11. It's easily the best looking circuit in Gran Turismo 3, even if it's among the worst to drive on. I feel a sense of deja vu here. Now I'm using the PC SX2 emulator to record gameplay for this review, which sharpens things to the point where a PS2 can't possibly look like this. And there are a few graphical hiccups, texture flicker, texture pop in, and all the car's rims looking like they're made out of tin. Still, for 2001, this was stunning to behold. The burnt rubber on the road, the waving flags, the brakes inside the wheel going orange. You can hear the road noises from tires and whenever you're slipstreaming behind another opponent. But my favorite part, actually no, it's my second favorite part, is in the replays you can see the heat generating from the cars and the tarmac. That is such a cool effect, which combined with the smoother frame rate without any slowdown, and the camera angle changes synchronizing to the beats of the music. Seriously, this is one of the best aged video games on the PlayStation 2. You don't even need to compare GT3 to its predecessor, just look at other racing games that came out the same year. There were plenty of reasons to buy a PlayStation 2 in 2001, and this was one of them. And this brings me to my #1 favorite part of Gran Turismo 3, the soundtrack. Whether it's in the menus or on the track, oh my god. And I mean that in a good way. I recorded the intro for the re-review of the first Gran Turismo a few months ago, just a day by feeder. It gave me legit goosebumps watching it for the first time in years. I couldn't believe it. I admit, I played Gran Turismo 3 sporadically throughout the years to capture footage for certain reviews, but every time I do when the music is playing on all fronts, like when I reviewed the first couple of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater titles in 2021, it always brings me to those early years in a flash. Again, it's a case of I grew up with this game, putting so many hours into it, so it's one of the best by default. We all feel that way about a lot of games, but I can't think of anybody thinking it's a bad soundtrack. Whether it's the PAL or NTSC playlist with a few tracks composed by Daiki Kasho exclusively for this game, it's almost a completely different one without it. When out on the track, Yamauchi also wanted unique AI that behaved more like humans, in which you drive dirty, they get aggressive too, drive right near their tail, they start to make mistakes, usually by driving too fast around a corner. And as you can see, the opponent is trying to find a way ahead while avoiding contact with you. However, the rubber banding system is just as blatant as the predecessor on these earlier events, mostly the ones that don't have tyre wear. For example, in the professional league of the same event, I can bowl them over with the right car. But in the amateur league, the opponents are keeping up. A Lotus Sport Elise, a Toyota MR2, only a few seconds behind a Toyota GT1. I know it obviously doesn't stop me from winning, you get the idea by now. It's just that part of my brain that doesn't like seeing it unfold. I suppose by the time it's obvious, your car is fast enough for it to be impossible for opponents to overtake no matter how hard they try. So long as you don't make a mistake, which is unlikely given how flawless the driving mechanics are, but I'll get to that as well. But going back to the event structure, this creates the same problem as Gran Turismo 2, in which the GT mode is more akin to predictable trophy collecting, where the opponents are about as challenging as those template ghost cars and time trials. The race or championship is already won before the lights go out, and you're going from scraping the bottom of the barrel to save up for credits to feeling tedious in a different way. The professional events, for example, take as long as 20 minutes per race to complete. There are too many 10 race championships, and none of them have horsepower limits, which encourages the player to cheap upgrade their cars if they get even slightly frustrated. Yes, there are some that only allow non-tuned cars, and some that are actually hard no matter how much you upgrade a car, but for 90% of events, this is considered too easy of a game, since all you need to do is, if you're stuck, is slap some upgrades onto a car, almost like an RPG in a way. But as is the norm with the Gran Turismo series, there is no such thing as the right or wrong approach. Every playthrough is different, and this is just mine. If you prefer the challenge, simply don't put as many upgrades on your car and turn off the driving assist. Some might get their enjoyment that way. Whereas I get mine from simply driving and collecting lots of different cars in this game with the aforementioned music in the background. And the events basically help me decide what to drive next. And these cars are miles better to drive than the PS1 titles, thanks to the focusing graphics, no less. According to Kaz, the driving is designed in a way that cars are more complex. The improved environmental mapping, the way they bump on the road oh so slightly to demonstrate the tarmac isn't 100% smooth, really subtle effects that improve engagement between road and tyres and can only be noticed close up. But comparing the experience to the PS1 titles, it makes the cars easier to drive. It's basically a refinement of those games with more optional driving assists, including traction control, anti-spin, and on the dashboard there's a number telling you what gear to be in when approaching the corner, and flashes telling you to brake now, essentially an invisible racing line that has been an invaluable feature of the series growing up, because I consider it a better source for teaching racing lines and track memorization over the license tests. You can argue that out of all the games in the Gran Turismo series, the third one is the easiest to pick up and play. It's more about getting the player to understand how a real car behaves, rather than each car controlling exactly the same as their real-life counterpart, but still being a simulator at heart. You still need to think about drivetrain, surface, braking, accelerating, tyre wear, and the kind of upgrades you may have put on a certain car. Like, just because you install 1,000,000 horsepower onto the bonnet solely doesn't equal better. The event that basically turned the tide on the GT mode in this playthrough, it was a standard Skyline GTR with a turbo from a rocket ship, and basically blitzed the competition on the straights, but handled like a wheelchair around the corners. Therefore, I barely won. It was probably the most exciting and hilarious race of the whole playthrough. It's rare to have simulators that allow for so many different ways to have fun. Just imagine how much of a handful it would be if I knew how to turn off the driving assists at the time. Braking and accelerating is a lot more prominent thanks to the PlayStation 2 controllers having pressure sensitive buttons. I'm actually not the biggest fan of these because from my experience they're not very reliable, though during the special license test for example I had to change the button layout to use the right analog stick for braking and accelerating because of how touchy and overpowered the faster cars were, especially the final test going around Monaco with those driving assists turned off. I am so relieved the final exam is not a whole lap around complex string. It's likely I'll use this button layout if I ever re-review Gran Turismo 4 in the future. For this playthrough, since I'm using the PC SX2 with a PlayStation 4 controller which doesn't allow pressure sensitive buttons, it's either nothing or full throttle, which is mostly fine when the driving assists are turned on. In my opinion, this is the most fun balance of simulation and arcade. Just note that in order to turn off the driving aids in the Gran Turismo mode for your own garage, you have to do it in the car settings here. For ages I was wondering why they were on despite being clearly turned off in the options menu. Just pointing it out in case any of you fall into the same trap. It's tedious going for every individual car, but whatever. The least I can say is there's something for everyone with this game. No matter what car you hop in, whether you have the driving assist turned on or off, these cars are a lot more manageable. And the improvements on all fronts, both graphically and handling, combine for a silky smooth experience when out on the track while still being a sim racer at heart. With 14.8 million copies sold, Gran Turismo 3 is the second best selling game on the PlayStation 2, only behind Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, obviously number 1 in exclusive, as well as, this might surprise you, number 1 in the entire Gran Turismo series, which, given how successful each title is on their respective console, that is saying something. And yet, in retrospective, out of the main series, at least for a long time, when people talked about the best of the PlayStation 2 or the best racing games, Gran Turismo 3 was hardly talked about. Maybe it's the volume of content available. It's easy to call GT3 a tech demo for the PS2 in comparison to what we expect from the series after, or actually back then anyway, but we still loved it because where it lacked in a number of cars and tracks, it more than made up for it everywhere else. It might be me as a little kid in the early 2000s being more easily impressed, but I can't stress enough just how much of an overwhelming leap this game was graphically, while still being so fun to drive these cars. It's certainly the most user-friendly of the Gran Turismo series, apart from the first couple of hours. Yeah, they should have structured it better so you don't race in a Sunday Cup 18 times like I did. Maybe it's because I value time more than I used to as a kid. We all do. Fortunately, that's the only real criticism I have with Gran Turismo 3, and again, it's worth the grind once you have access to a faster garage. GT3 A-Spec is still my favourite in the series. It's still a masterpiece, and reviewing it again, it felt nostalgic enough that it almost feels like having a week-long break. And to say I recommend it is an understatement, but it's likely anyone watching this video would have already put countless hours into this game. But if you haven't, well, given the number of copies sold, it's one of the easiest games to find on the cheap. Putting quality over quantity and not being a noticeable glitch fest like Gran Turismo 2, just simple, no-nonsense racing, sort of. Gran Turismo 3 was the perfect showcase of what the PlayStation 2 was capable of during what is considered the best year for the console. And now it's 21 years old at the time of this video. Jesus Christ, that makes me feel old. Thank you guys on Patreon for your support, and a special thanks to Alex Vidal, Bibbs, Riddleback, Darcy McIntosh, David Myers, Eric Barboza, Ian Walker, Jerry Thomas, Keza BFZ, Maxims, Mike Camille, Nando Boy, Ruffian Shark, and VXL. And of course, thank you all for watching. I really miss playing Gran Turismo 3, like putting a lot of time back into it again. It genuinely was the first PS2 game I ever saw back in 2002. It's one of the main reasons I'm re-reviewing the Gran Turismo series again. It's a good excuse to just play these games again and get something out of it. As well as update my opinion, like compare this video to the original GT3 review. It's a good illustration of how much I've improved as a game reviewer and video editor. Anyway, don't forget to check out the other reviews on this channel, support on Patreon, follow on Twitter, Facebook, and speak to you soon.